Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Roast to Ceilings podcast. Today we have a special guest. Rue, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, nice to meet you all. I'm Rue Spence. I'm the founder of the podcasting agency Sonivia, and I'm super excited to be here.
Sonovia, was that the name? That sounds
Sonivia.
Sonivia.
Yeah.
That sounds so cool. Does that mean anything? But does it just sound really cool?
Okay, I already love this conversation because this is one of my favorite things to talk about. We'll probably get into it later. I started podcasting by starting a podcast like you guys. And then that podcast ended and I was like, I still really love this and I couldn't shake loose of it. So I started like freelance editing.
Mm.
And that eventually grew into like a real thing. And I was like, well, like if I'm gonna do taxes, I kind of have to name this thing. I can't just be like, hey, I'm Rue and I do podcast stuff. Like that's the IRS doesn't know what that means. So I had to name it. And I was playing around because, naming something is always like the hardest part for me. Like I'll make the thing, but just don't make me title it. And so I was like, I want it to have like something to do with like sound or audio or, so I'm going into like root words and like Latin. I'm like, okay, so like sonus. Okay, I like that. And then my daughter was a newborn at that time. So I was like, I really want to kind of pass it on to her, have my little Beyonce Blue Ivy moment and kind of give that energy to her. And so I was like, her name's Olivia. So I was like, like, how can I blend these? And so Nivea. And so I Googled it to make sure it wasn't something like terrible, right? Or like already in use. And it actually is the Latin word for the enlargement of sound. And because Latin is a gendered language, it's actually the female version. And I work specifically with female and non binary clients. So it's like women making their sound bigger is exactly what I do. And I got full body chills.
That is so sick. It has to be a sign of something that you just stumbled upon this, surely. There's
That's how
no
I felt too.
No, yeah, and like things having meaning, names having meaning is always the coolest thing because you're like, wow, thought went into this. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks for letting me. I get jazzed every time I get to tell that story. It still makes me tingly. I
Sure.
love that name.
One question I had real quick was you mentioned before you started your agency, you were hosting your own podcast, but that came to an end. Could you talk a little bit about why you decided that was the time to end that podcast?
Yeah, so I started it during 2020 and it was the pandemic and I was actually living overseas at the time. I was in Germany. So I was
Mm.
super isolated. They closed down really hard and I was really homesick and scared. I mean, it was scary. And I was like, I miss my friends and family and everyone was at home, everyone was starting sourdough bread projects and stuff. And so me and one of my girlfriends would just get on Zoom once a week and we'd just talk about scary stories and stuff. And when we are like, this kind of sounds like a podcast. And so we decided to actually make something of it. She's an actor and a producer, so she has kind of that background. I've always been into technical stuff. I have a technical theater background. And so we are like, let's make a podcast. So we did, and it was awesome. It was a lot of fun. And then, kind of as things opened up, she was able to go back to work and being in acting and in the creative world, she would be like booked out for like 6 weeks at a time. And so it just felt like one more stressor. And we're like, you know what? This has been fun, but like, I think it's probably time for us to let it go so that we can focus on other endeavors right now.
Yeah, that's really sick. And I know it's definitely hard to realize when something's come to a natural end.
Mhm.
But that's always better than like getting into a huge disagreement and having to delete the podcast, really. So yeah, that's really cool. But one thing that was really interesting from what you just said is you mentioned both of you had like very like technical, producey kind of backgrounds. Um, I know nothing about the technical side of podcasts. We usually just hit record and then upload it. Right. So could you talk a little bit about what actually goes on behind the scenes of a typical podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So you guys do like mostly interviews. So for you, it probably looks a lot like kind of knowing a little bit about who you're talking to just to make sure they're a good fit, or you kind of know what kind of questions you want to ask. But like for the show that I was doing, it was really research heavy. We were like looking into like true crimes and scary stuff. And so we would, have these research notes. It was almost like writing an essay, right? You're like, okay, or giving a presentation. And
Mhm.
so we were doing tons of research, and that was a huge time commitment for us. And then actually recording, which with me being overseas at the time, there was like a 7 hour time difference. So we were trying to make that work. So that goes into it. Then you sit down and record. That's probably the most like easiest fun part is actually doing the thing. And then post production can kind of look like whatever it needs to. For some people, they don't really like to touch it too much afterwards, and then there are some people who like will overlay sound effects and music interludes and all kinds of crazy stuff. So it really just looks like what you want it to look like and what feels good for you, but there really isn't a right or wrong answer. It just depends on the show in question.
So when you decided to do a podcasting agency, Sonivia instead, do you feel like there were some challenges to like adapt to each person's different style then?
Oh yeah. I mean, everyone has quirks, right? And it's kind of like working with the public in general. Like, you get some people who have different personality styles. Like I have this one client who just I think it's like a misophonia thing. Like she hates the
Um,
sound of breath.
mm.
And so if there is a breath, she's like, get it gone, like eliminate. I don't care what it takes, cut it out. And then there are other people who have like dogs in the background and they like live in New York and so there's subways going by and they're just like, let it be. And so it's, tailoring to every person's style and what works for them. That's probably the hardest part because like I have my ear and I think things should sound a certain way, but there's kind of like that. I like to make money. And so if the client says that they want it this way, I kind of have to like cancel out what my ear thinks and be like, okay, but this is what they want.
So like the customer is always right mindset still applies
Yeah.
in podcasting.
And part of like the agency side of it is that I do offer a lot of education and I try to be like, okay, that's cool. If you're open to some feedback, I think that this would make it better.
Do they take the feedback most of the time?
My clients typically do because I get to be very selective and only work with people who I kind of vibe with.
Yeah, can you expand on that a little bit? Like, what does it take for you to be like, wow, this is a podcast I want to help with?
Yeah. So, I mean, first is like the topic because I'm going to be spending a lot of time with you. And so liking the topic is a great start. Or liking you. Hopefully both, but at least one or the other. Like if you're like, yeah, I talk about MMA, like I'm not an MMA girly, but if like that's your thing and you're super cool, I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to learn about MMA. But if you're like, yeah, I do an MMA podcast and like you're not my kind of cup of tea person, I'm like, well, let me refer you to someone else because that's probably not going to work for me. But yeah, just someone who I get along with. Just you get that spark, where you're like, I love what you're doing. You excite me. I want to work with you and help you improve this.
I had no idea people were saying, let me refer you to someone else as a nice way of saying, I am not the
We're
person.
using that one.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Take that one hands down. It's not copyrighted or anything.
Could you just quickly throw out some of the most like out there niche podcast topics you've come across?
um, let's see. So I had one, and this is a I'm not the one for you. I had these guys from Australia, and I typically work with women, or gender nonconforming people, and they were guys, and I was like, okay, let me see. And they're like, yeah, if you could just do like a sample edit for us, and I was like, sure. They send me their podcast, and it's just I don't know if I can say this on your show, like Joe Rogan adjacent, where it's just like woman hating, racist, homophobic. And I was just like, respectfully, absolutely not. Like, this is not gonna work for me. And I was like, you guys are Australian. Like, why do you care about American politics so much? But yeah, that was wild. I definitely was not the fit for them. Some of my more nichey ones. Gosh, I don't know. I work with them so much that it doesn't feel niche to me anymore. I have a grief podcast that I'm working with that just started, and it's kind of like a Dear Sugar where like people write into her and she's like an
Oh,
expert in grief and so she'll answer their questions kind of like an advice column. And I'm really enjoying that one. She just got that started in December and it's been really beautiful to work with that.
no, that sounds so interesting. Um, I'm still very confused about the Australian guy podcast because you very much are very open about the fact that your agency works with people of more like discriminated genders or gender non-conforming people. So I'm not sure how they put those dots together.
Yeah, I was like, I don't think you're gonna like me either. And then afterwards, I told my husband, I was like, man, I got this like weird, interest call earlier, and he's like, you should have just done it and just like taken out all of the racist, homophobic, misogynistic stuff and be like, here's your 3-minute episode.
and get paid while doing it.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. But I was like, that probably isn't super ethical, so I turned it down. I also didn't want to listen to it. Like, even if I was editing it, I was like, nah, not worth it. I don't want that polluting my brain.
Oh, I can even imagine sitting there while, because editing it, you have to replay it tons of times, don't you?
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. It takes me typically about twice as long as the actual recording to edit.
Ooh.
Oh,
No.
wow.
Yeah, no, I was also like more on the topic of who your agency chooses to represent. How did you kind of get to the idea of like, not only do I want to start a podcast agency, I want to make sure I want to push equality. Like, how did that thought stem?
To do equality. So really that came from when I started my first show. Um, I'm self-taught and so I was going to YouTube University like I think we all do when we start a new project, and I was looking up everything. I was on Reddit forums, I was on YouTube, I was, Facebook groups, all of it. And everything that I found was for male voices, which fine, but I would try those exact same techniques exactly as they prescribed in the YouTube video, and I sounded like hot garbage. And that's because typically what we think of as a woman's voice is about an octave higher than a man's voice. So as you're editing, like equalizing, if you guys are familiar with that, the shape of the voice, well, if you follow exactly that prescriptive YouTube video, you're doing it about an octave on the wrong side. And so you sound like you're underwater talking through a tin can. And so I was like, there's just nothing out there for us. And so I really had to kind of do the baptism by fire and work extra hard. And I was like, there are so many of us out there who want to make podcasts. Like, there are already barriers of women in tech, women in STEM, which podcasting kind of is that. And then, you add the extra barriers of like time commitments for families. I work with a lot of mothers. I'm a mother myself. Like, I don't have a lot of time to mess around and play with that. So it's like, I want to support women with not having to do the work I did. I'm very much a lift as you climb person. And I'm like, I didn't go through all of that self edification to just let it sit and rot in my brain. Like, it needs to go somewhere, and it's clearly not out there. And I will say that was 5 years ago at this point. It's gotten a lot better. I think it's still not perfect, but I'm thrilled that there are more agencies like me. I want to give a shout out to the Golden Goose Collective. They're amazing. And it excites me to see more women in this space. But at that time, it really didn't exist.
First of all, I'm really glad you said what you said about technology, because now I can call myself a STEM girly just for being just for being here, which is great.
That's it.
But also, I think it is mind-blowing how people didn't even consider that people other than those with stereotypically lower voices could even do podcasting. Like, that wasn't even a thought. That was just like the norm, and there's no way anyone could be outside of that. That's just mind-blowing, because if you think about the concept of podcasting, at least to me, which is just speaking, there's nothing intrinsically masculine about that at all, I feel like. So I'm curious to what you have to say. Like, why don't you feel there are more women in podcasting?
Oh, we're doing it. um, so I think it's like many other industries that we see where women do it for free. And I say that with, when you look at like the most like Michelin 5-star rated chefs out there, many of them are men. But who cooks most of our meals at home? It's
Woman.
typically women.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think it's one of those things that, we do it for free, but then when it becomes a monetized or a side hustle or an industry, it belongs to men. I can't tell you how many times maybe you've gotten it written on your report card that you talk too much in class, or you're chatty, or women are gossips and all women do is talk and nag, 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 nag. But then when it's podcasting, where it's talking for a purpose, we see only 29% of the podcasting industry belongs to women.
Oh, wow.
29.
29, yeah, and only 2% is gender expansive people.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so I think it really does come down to that free labor thing. Is it's fine if women talk and gossip all day for free, but when we think we have the audacity to do it as a podcast, it's like, oh well, that's Howard Stern and Joe Rogan.
No, I'm like every time I try to go on Spotify and looking at podcast charts, Joe Rogan for some I don't know how he has always been at the top consistently. And while I have noticed there are some more women starting to climb the ranks, like you said, it is still majority of them are still men. But do you think that's been changing in like the past 2, 3-ish years? Like, has that 29 number been growing at all?
I definitely think that it is. And I think that it's one of those kind of like separating the wheat from the chaff things where I feel like women led shows are often more successful. I think that uh, we saw a big factor with that with My Favorite Murder starting the Exactly Right network. Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark. I couldn't think of her last name for a second. They did a lot of work on expanding that. I think a lot of times when people think podcasting at this point, at least My Favorite Murder is somewhere in that when you're thinking about what's a podcast.
No, for sure. I think that just personally, I was thinking that a lot of women tend to, when they have to go to podcasting, I've seen people like, oh, I have to plan this, I have to have this super interesting topic, I have to get this super good sound editing, I have to do blah 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 blah. Well, a lot of guys that I know will probably just be like, oh, I'm just gonna start. So is there like, have you noticed this with your clients too? Are some more reluctant to start for whatever reasons?
Yeah, so you're almost directly quoting Liz Gilbert from Big Magic. I'm not sure if you've read that book.
I have not.
You should. It's fantastic. But she does. She talks about the outward confidence of men to just apply for a job that they're not credentialed for just to see if they get it. And women who will turn and say, "Well, I'm only 95% credentialed for that job, so it's not even worth trying." Because, we're kind of taught to make ourselves small. And I do think that in almost any endeavor is true. We really look for excuses to talk ourselves out of scary things. And it is hard to start a podcast. Like that's why I'm like kudos to you guys for putting yourselves out there because it is hard. It is hard to show up. It is embarrassing sometimes. It is nerve-wracking. You feel very self-conscious. You listen back to yourself and you go, "Oh my God, I sound like this. How do I have any friends?" It's hard.
No. Yeah, so
Awesome.
podcasting is genuinely, even though all you mentioned there are so many downsides, it's also really fun. So I really hate that there are so many barriers for other girls to get into the industry or just even start recording themselves talking. Because I just feel like there are a lot of positives to it. But I was also curious on what it is with an agency. Like you're branding yourself as an agency that helps specifically marginalized genders. How does that go? What is the response to that?
Largely good. I mean, there are trolls everywhere. I've had some, well, why only women? And I'm like, because we're 29% of the industry. Like, you're good. You're fine. Trust me, you're fine. And it's, I hashtag not all men, right? Like I provide tips. I have a podcast now currently where I share podcasting tips. And I'm like, guys, you're welcome to listen to it. Like we don't talk about tampons and podcasting over there. Like you can get some valuable stuff out of it. It is more tailored to our voices. But just like I was watching men's YouTube videos about podcasting for men, they didn't brand it as podcasting for men, but it was the default. And so now, by not being the default, I'm saying, hey, this is podcasting for women.
Mm.
If you're willing to listen to a woman give you advice, then I think you'll probably take something away from it. But I'm branding myself as for women because there's an absence of that. And I've had some great guys listen. I've had some really wonderful feedback from somebody who like slid into my DMs and was just like, your first episode brought me to tears because I didn't realize how this impacted women. And I was like, thank you. You're invited to the sleepover 100%. But yeah, so I mean it's there for whoever needs it and whoever is willing to go outside their comfort zone.
I think you're totally right when you say that so many times women and girls are told to make themselves seem small or put ourselves down. And I feel like that's definitely a good point that that's a big reason why we see less women in tech or STEM or podcasting. So what do you think we can do to kind of encourage that voice to come out?
You're doing it. I'm so
Oh,
proud of you. You're doing it. Just keep making it less exceptional. You know, I talk about that a lot. Like I have a daughter and my daughter is mixed race, and I just want to keep doing this until it stops being noteworthy. You know, until it stops being, oh, women doing this, women of color doing this, oh, you know, until it can just be like, hey, here's a podcast. You know, I think of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote, and, you know, someone was like, well, how many women do you think should be on the Supreme Court? When will you stop all this? And she said, when there are 12. And people are like, 12 women on the Supreme Court? And she was like, yeah, there's been 12 men and no one said anything. And so I think that just continuing to make it less exceptional by continuing to break these barriers
Mhm.
is the way forward. That the more people who start podcasts, the more women who start podcasts, the more women of color who start podcasts, the less exceptional it becomes, the less shock value there is when you see it for the first time. And I think that that is the way forward, probably not for us, hopefully for my daughter, hopefully for our grandkids, hopefully down the road. You know, I think about for like our grandparents, podcasts didn't exist, but you know, the things that they couldn't have imagined for inclusivity that today are unremarkable for us. That, you know, I think of like water fountains. My daughter will never question what water fountain she drinks from. That is unremarkable to her. To my husband's grandmother, that would bring her to tears. And so I think about that. And I think that for women being included in any conversation, it's just continuing to do it a little bit each day.
Gosh.
So well spoken. I'm just like taking it
Oh.
all in. No, for sure. Like that really made me think because a lot of what we try to do is talk about like, hey, look, here's a woman being able to do this. Here's a woman being able to do this that was seen as typically men. But now I'm trying to think like, why is it so like crazy to think, oh, a woman is doing that, um, when it shouldn't be. So I'm really glad you said that. I think it's gonna shift a lot of perspectives with this.
That's the goal. That's the goal for sure.
Mhm. And on a more technical note, I know a lot of people have reached out to us, like our peers, saying, "How do I start a podcast? How do I record something?" So just basic beginner tips for podcasts. What do you have?
Yeah. So start with your idea. Start with something that you love and you could talk about to anyone. You know, you'll stop people walking down the street. Hey, I want to tell you about this thing. Like whatever gets you really excited. That is your topic, you know, because I have sometimes people like, well, I don't know what I would talk about. It's like, you probably do, though. Like, they're probably, whether you're willing to admit it out loud to a million people, that might be another story, but everyone has a thing. And so just starting with that, I really like to start with the topic before we even get into like, what microphone should I buy? Start with your content. And if you can't come up with like 30 things within that niche that you would talk about, you need to go back and refine it. So really spend some time with that, figure that out, and then start to shape it out. You know, what kind of podcasts do you like? You know, do you like interview ones? Do you like solo ones? Do you like ones that are just like two friends sitting on the couch talking about whatever's happening in their lives? Think about what kind of model that's going to look like and then lean into that and figure out, okay, so if I'm doing this remotely, like on Zoom, like we're doing right now, you know, what tech do I need for that? Or if we're sitting in the same room, because that changes like what kind of setup you have. So once you figure that out, it's time to find your tech, and you know, get whatever microphone works for you. I'm using a super bougie one, but I also really love this little cheapie off Amazon. It's like $50. So you don't have to have the top of the line to get started. You know, so just getting started, I think is the big one. Record. You can record in Audacity for free. You can edit there for free. Spotify for podcasters is a free hosting platform. That's a place where your podcast can live on the internet. Um, those would be like my barest just getting started, you know, fast tips.
It's awesome. Yeah, I think refining the idea, that's definitely so important. And 30 things to talk about, that can be hard for a lot of topics. So I love that you mentioned that.
Definitely. And that's somewhere too that, you know, because I have people like get that deer in the headlight. They're like, I don't know how I would come up with that many topics. And I'm like, well, but you do though. You know, what are other people asking when you're having conversations about it? And you know, Google it. What are people talking about? You know, Google does like the autofill. how many of those autofill things could be episodes? You can use AI. I know AI is a big conversation, but you can ask Chat GPT, give me 100 ideas for this thing, and most of them are going to be trash, but they'll at least get your wheels turning to go, huh, I hadn't thought about it like that.
Mhm. And another thing is, like you were inspired in 2020, there have been a lot more podcasts recently since COVID. So out of all of those, what do you think makes a podcast successful? What do you think makes one stick out?
Yeah, consistency. I
Mhm.
really think consistency is key. And that's why I emphasize having so many topics in the beginning, because to me at least, and I've seen this echo out in a lot of my clients, not knowing what you're going to talk about makes it really hard to talk about it. If you're like, well, I have an episode that has to come out this week and I have no idea what it's going to be about, you spend the time that you should be preparing for that episode, you spend that freaking out about what it's even going to be about. So if you have this list, even if you don't, you can, I had a coffee can for a while, just like a little Cafe Bustelo, and I put all of the ideas I could think about
Oh.
into there. And when I would get roadblocked, I'd have the list of things I was like, on my calendar, I'm going to talk about this and this and this. But then if I either like didn't feel into it, or it got too, there wasn't enough research out there that I could do, I was like, okay, I got to pivot last minute. I would just reach into the coffee can and be like, all right, looks like I'm talking about this week. Just to help get over that brainstorming hurdle.
Oh, that's such a genius idea. Like sometimes you when you have a list, you just don't want to go through the list. You don't want to choose something from the list. So having just fate choose for you, I guess is such a good tip. Thank you for sharing that one.
My pleasure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think to end us off, I would love if you were to give maybe just a piece of advice to our audience, which is mainly teen girls. And I think that you'd be the perfect person for that. So,
Thank you. I'm loving this like big sister energy. Um, so I think that the biggest advice that I can kind of pigeonhole into being both podcasting and life advice
Mhm.
is to not be afraid to take up space.
Yeah.
I am a full-on millennial, and so I was raised very much in the like make yourself small, both physically and emotionally and mentally. Be as small as you can, be as good as you can, and anything else is bad. And so take up space, do it badly, learn from it. Don't stay in the bad, but start there is fine. Don't be afraid to make those mistakes. In podcasting, I like to say it's not heart surgery. You could really bomb, and yeah, you're gonna embarrass yourself, and yeah, you're gonna cringe. No one dies at the end of the day. There is literally no way that you can podcast so badly, like maybe you get canceled. End of list. But in life too, don't make yourself small when someone's on the sidewalk. You get to take up space. They can also move. So take up space in all things you do. Be nice about it. Be kind, but understand that you have just as much right to take up that space as anybody else.
Mhm. So man spread mentally a little.
Yes. Man spread mental. I love that.
No, thank you so much for everything you've said, talked about, and taught us today. We are gonna be internalizing this one the most, I feel like.
yeah, it's gonna
So
take a
is
while.
almost everyone. Because like almost everything you said could be a metaphor for life as well, not just podcasting.
I try. Thank you so much for having me on and letting me chat about podcasts.
Thank
Of course.
you.
Any last thing you want to promote, shout out before we let you go?
Yeah, so if anyone is thinking about starting a podcast, I host Up an Octave, which again refers to where our voices are. Um, Episodes come out every Tuesday. The first episode of this year was kind of a crash course in podcasting. It's basically baby stepping what I take my clients through. Um, and you can access it for free. So you can get all of that information on my podcast. You can follow me over on Instagram at Sonivia Studios, Sonivia Studios. I share more tips and tricks there. And yeah, that's kind of my jam. So
We'll definitely check it out.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
awesome. Thanks, ladies. Have